the contingency is certainly possible, and we'll have to consider making accommodations for that later. What? No! You have to make accommodations for that now. You have to put safeguards in for that before a law is inappropriately signed. You have to avoid a constitutional crisis, not deal with it when it arrives. When I was considering whether or not to go forward with this episode, because I know this is all kinds of wonky and people won't listen and I won't make any money on this episode, but that moment, that sealed it for me. That's proof that they haven't thought this through. And when really important holes in their plan were pointed out, they did jack shit about it. At least some of us in America have to know what kind of constitutional clusterfuck is possible now that proxy voting is allowed.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 217th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, you've picked a good episode to start with. I started this podcast almost 8 years ago because I realized that I didn't know very much about my branch of the federal government, Congress, because the corporate media focuses almost exclusively on the presidency and the campaigns for the presidency. But it's Congress that controls where the tens of thousands of my money that I pay in taxes goes. It's Congress that's supposed to control when and where we go to war. It's Congress that makes our laws, that chooses what rules our entire country is supposed to live by and what behavior can land our asses in people cages. Congress is the most important branch, and so I started watching and learning out loud. Now, this podcast has changed a lot in the last 8 years. I started with the naive attempt to read and report on every bill that passed, but I now know that because Congress operates so differently from how the textbooks led us to believe it functions, that reading every bill is quite impossible. Now I'm doing deeper dives. I've been picking topics and researching the backgrounds and histories of whatever topic I'm into that week in order to really understand the details of what is going on currently in Congress. And I'm covering as many subjects as I can while fiercely guarding the independence of this podcast. Because I don't see this country through any ideological lens. I don't label myself, and it pisses me off when other people think they can slap a label on me and read my thoughts. And so here's your warning, especially for this episode. If you do see politics as a team sport and desire information to be fed to you on a partisan spoon, then you're going to hate this episode. Because today's topic, the House of Representatives' new proxy voting procedures, is one of those topics where everyone has a point and everyone is doing something wrong. There are nuances galore. And you need to know that the reason that this podcast is going to sound and feel different from just about everything else out there is because of its independence. I'm the only person who picks the content and does the research. And the most important thing I do is that I give you all my sources, including timestamps for all the hearing clips, in the show notes so that you can see where I'm getting my information from, so you can easily listen to my sound clips in full and in context, and so that I can earn your trust. This is my full-time job. It has been since late 2014. And instead of taking ads and selling your time for cash, I produce this show for you with the help of hundreds of producers who voluntarily pay for the show in whatever amount matches the value they receive from it. This funding model allows me to tell you what I find to be true regardless of which party or company could get pissed off. Because there is no one person or party or company with the power to pull the financial rug from out underneath me. And so if you value the information or entertainment that I'm going to give you today, the information I promise that you're not going to get in this much detail anywhere else. Well, if you value this, please consider becoming a producer. And if you don't like the golf swing sound effect that I put over the fucks and shits, which is necessary to keep this show in podcast directories in some huge countries such as China and India, well, you can produce the show per episode on Patreon in whatever amount you choose and get yourself a golf swing free feed if you want. But there are lots of other ways to pay, and you choose the amount. Everything above $0 is fair to me. So the other options include PayPal, paper checks, Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, Bitcoin. All of those are listed in every episode's show notes, including this episode's show notes, in your podcast app or at congressionaldish.com. And the producers can have their comments read during the bonus thank you episodes that I produce for the community between the main numbered episodes. And thank you to everyone who is already producing this show. You know I wouldn't still be doing this without you. The episode I have for you today is wonky as all hell. Because in mid-May, the Democrats, who have the majority of the seats in the House of Representatives, changed the procedures for how the House votes on bills to allow absent members to vote via members who are physically present in a process called proxy voting. This is the first time that this has been allowed in the House of Representatives in United States history. Today, I'm going to tell you how this plan was crafted, and we're going to look at the details of it. Those of you who listened to the last thank you episode all the way to the end know that I was unsure about this topic at first. I actually delayed it because I didn't think I had a full episode here. But the further down the rabbit hole I went, the more concerned I became. Basically, the Democrats enacted some unnecessary, unprecedented changes to the way the House passes bills that might also be unconstitutional, which I think is kind of a big deal. And I know how extreme that sentence sounds. And so here's my explanation of why that extreme sentence is also accurate and what the repercussions could be. So the rule change in the House that gave way to proxy voting was actually a package of rule changes. And one of the changes that it made is that it allowed remote hearings to take place. Now, this is actually something that I've been begging for since March because it should be obvious to everyone that there needs to be oversight of the Trump administration. The new rules allow all committees to conduct their hearings with both members of the House and witnesses. That allows all of those people to participate basically over video chat, and members can cast votes in committees remotely as well. Now, when it comes to committees, members voting while not physically present isn't exactly new. Up until the mid-1990s, members of the House were able to vote by proxy in committees, so they could have someone else cast their vote for them, because members often serve on multiple committees, and they would have hearings taking place at the same time. And so a member would be allowed to tell another member how they intend to vote, and then go down the hall to their other meeting. The House killed that rule in the mid-90s, but the Senate still allows it to this day. But in all of those instances, the members were still in Washington, D.C., They had to write down their intended votes and sign them. And so remote voting from their cushy homes, often thousands of miles away, that aspect is brand new. The new rules allow this to be done in all committees except for committees that want to close their meetings to the public. So no secret committee hearings will be allowed to be conducted remotely except for the Ethics Committee, which is the committee that investigates members of Congress. So the only one allowed to keep their meetings secret while meeting remotely is the one that investigates their own crimes. And I'm struggling real hard to think of a single reason why the Ethics Committee meetings should ever be allowed to be kept secret at all. And so giving that committee permission to conduct secret remote hearings, I find that unacceptable. But this is what happens when people are allowed to police themselves and their bosses, us, pay no attention to what they're doing. They can easily get away with self-serving shit like this. Regardless, this part of the rule changes, the remote hearings, was pretty uncontroversial, and had it been passed on its own, probably would have done so fairly easily. This is Representative Rodney Davis of Illinois in the House Rules Committee hearing. This is the only hearing that took place about the rules changes on May 14th, 2020.
We do not oppose, as Republicans, and you can see in the plan as was submitted for the record, we do not oppose remote hearings. We do not oppose utilizing technology.
But like I said before, the Democrats chose to combine all the rule changes in one package. And that package also included allowing proxy voting on the floor of the House of Representatives, where they vote on the bills. Before this rule change, the House had rules already on the books for what they should do in the case of an emergency, exactly like this COVID-19 one. Back in March, the staff for the Democrats on the House Rules Committee submitted a report that examined their existing options for voting during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it concluded that, quote, by far the best option is to use the existing House rules and current practices, unquote, which would mean passing legislation by unanimous consent. Unanimous consent is a process used where a bill is presented for passage, and if no one objects, then it's passed without a vote. And unanimous consent is something that we have been familiar with here in the Congressional Dish universe for a very long time. In fact, unanimous consent is one of the reasons that I continued producing this podcast way back in 2013, because I was so horrified when I saw it used to gut the Stock Act. It was a key moment for me. It was the moment that I knew that there were things going on in Congress, important and shameful things, that were being covered by no one. It's when I knew for sure that I had a reason to commit to this show. And it all started in late 2011, when the TV show 60 Minutes aired an expose that detailed how members of Congress had written laws in a way that exempted themselves from insider trading laws. And so members of Congress were getting rich using the business information they received as members of Congress to make profitable bets in the stock market casino. Here's some highlights from that 60 Minutes segment, and I've included the entire segment for you in the show notes if you want to watch it uncut.
Most former congressmen and senators manage to leave Washington, if they ever leave Washington, with more money in their pockets than they had when they arrived. Peter Schweizer is a fellow at the Hoover Institution, a conservative think tank at Stanford University. A year ago, he began working on a book about soft corruption in Washington with a team of 8 student researchers who reviewed financial disclosure records. Schweizer says he wanted to know why some congressmen and senators managed to accumulate significant wealth beyond their salaries and proved particularly adept at buying and selling stocks.
For example, insider trading on the stock market. If you are a member of Congress, those laws are deemed not to apply.
So congressmen get a pass on insider trading?
They do. The fact is, if you sit on a healthcare committee and you know that Medicare, for example, is considering not reimbursing for a certain drug, that's market-moving information. And if you can trade stock off of that information and do so legally, that's a great profit-making opportunity, and that sort of behavior goes on.
Why does Congress get a pass on this?
It's really the way the rules have been defined, and the people who make the rules are the political class in Washington, and they've conveniently written them in such a way that they don't apply to themselves.
The segment highlighted members of Congress and gave examples of how they profited. Most of the people who were highlighted, like ex-Speaker of the House John Boehner, have already left Congress. But one of them still remains.
If you were a senator, Steve, and I gave you $10,000 cash, one or both of us is probably going to go to jail. But if I'm a corporate executive and you're a senator, and I give you IPO shares in stock, and over the course of one day, that stock nets you $100,000, that's completely legal.
And former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her husband had participated in at least 8 IPOs. One of those came in 2008 from Visa, just as a troublesome piece of legislation that would have hurt credit card companies began making its way through the House. Undisturbed by a potential conflict of interest, the Pelosi's purchased 5,000 shares of Visa at the initial price of $44. 2 days later, it was trading at $64. The credit card legislation never made it to the floor of the House.
And if you do that math, that means that Pelosi made $100,000 on that Visa IPO in 2 days. At the end of the 60 Minutes segment, a solution was presented by a former congressman who had tried and failed to do something about this corruption while serving in the House.
Brian Baird is a former congressman from Washington State who served 6 terms in the House before retiring last year. He spent half of those 12 years trying to get his colleagues to prohibit insider trading in Congress and establish some rules governing conflicts of interest. In 2004, Baird and Congresswoman Louise Slaughter introduced the Stock Act, which would make it illegal for members of Congress to trade stocks on non-public information and require them to report their stock trades every 90 days instead of once a year.
How far did you get with this?
We didn't get anywhere. Just flat died. Went nowhere.
How many co-sponsors did you get?
I think we got 6.
6 doesn't sound like a very big amount.
It's not, Steve. You could have National Cherry Pie Week and get 100 co-sponsors. I mean,
when Baird finally managed to get a congressional hearing on the Stock Act, almost no one showed up. It's reintroduced every session, but is buried so deep in the Capitol, we had trouble finding congressmen who had ever heard of it.
Well, after this aired, the Stock Act came to life. In 2012, because their bosses, us, were pissed off, Congress passed and Obama signed the Stock Act into law on April 4th, 2012. And they made a big deal about it. There was a signing ceremony, aired live with about a dozen members of Congress standing behind the president, all of them patting themselves on the backs for holding themselves accountable. even though the Stock Act didn't really hold them accountable. The Stock Act put the Ethics Committee in the House and in the Senate, yes, the same Ethics Committee that's now allowed to hold secret or remote hearings. Well, it put the ethics committees in charge of policing members of Congress who, quoting from the Stock Act, quote, may not use non-public information derived from such person's position as a member of Congress or employee of Congress or gained from the performance of such person's official responsibilities as a means for making a private profit, unquote. Now, obviously, this wasn't a strong law. In my opinion, all elected lawmakers and high-ranking federal law enforcers should either be required to have all their stocks in a blind trust or be prohibited from gambling on the stock market entirely while empowered to make or enforce our laws. This law didn't do that, and so it was always going to be weak. Also, letting Congress police themselves was a problem. But the real teeth in this law came from the form of public reporting requirements. The Stock Act was supposed to take the financial reports that were now going to be required from the president, vice president, members of Congress, and their staffs and put them on publicly available websites that would, quote, allow the public to search, sort, and download data contained in the reports, unquote, so that people like me and the Center for Responsive Politics and journalists all over the world could see what stocks they were trading. And so while our lawmakers were still allowed to continue to gamble on the stock market while in office, the public would be able to know what they were doing and hold them accountable, in theory. But the Stock Act in that form survived exactly 1 year and 11 days, because on April 15th, 2013, the day of the Boston Marathon bombing, President Obama quietly signed a law that gutted the Stock Act by exempting congressional staff and most executive branch employees from financial reporting, and by killing the easily searchable public database that was supposed to let us research their trades. If it weren't for the Center for Responsive Politics doing the dirty work of sifting through their paper reports and posting their findings online, I don't know how we would access their stock trade information. Although they're allowed to report their trades in obscenely broad ranges, and so the information isn't all that useful anyway. And members of Congress are definitely still using their insider knowledge to get rich on the stock market. We know that Senator Richard Burr and Senator Dianne Feinstein and Senator Imhoff of Oklahoma and the unelected lady married to the king of Wall Street, Senator Kelly Loeffler of Georgia, we know that they all sold stocks or bought stocks after a closed-door briefing on the coming COVID apocalypse before the rest of us knew about the economic clusterfuck ahead. Kelly Loeffler has already been let off the hook by Republican loyalist Bill Barr's Justice Department. Richard Burr stepped down as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, but he's still in Congress. No senator has spent a single second behind bars for this behavior. It's illegal on paper, but clearly not in practice. But for the purposes of this episode, even though all that is infuriating and wrong, it's the way the Stock Act, as weak as it was gutted in 2013 that matters, because it was gutted using unanimous consent. The Democrats started the process on Thursday, April 11th, 2013. In the middle of the day, when nothing had been going on in the Senate for at least a half hour, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware got the unanimous consent of an empty Senate chamber to gut the Stock Act.
With unanimous consent, the Senate now proceed to the consideration of S-716 introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-716, a bill to modify the requirements under the Stock Act requiring online access to certain financial disclosure statements and related forms.
Is there objection?
Is there objection to proceeding on the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
And the bill was passed just like that. The next day, the Republicans did the same thing in the House. It was a Friday afternoon, and all votes had been over for at least an hour, and so most members of the House of Representatives were on their way to the airport to go home. But then Representative Eric Cantor got the unanimous consent of an empty House chamber to gut the Stock Act.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table the bill S-716 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title.
Senate 716. An act to modify the requirements under the Stock Act regarding online access to certain financial disclosure statements and related forms.
Without objection, the bill is passed and a motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
And then, a couple days later, on Monday morning, Obama signed it into law. 2 hours after that, a bomb went off at the marathon, and this Boston resident was definitely distracted for a week, as was the national news media. But even after those heads, Tamerlan and Jahar, were dead and in jail, this wasn't a story. Like so much of what happens in our branch of the federal government, this was ignored. But it changed my life. And it introduced me, and you, if you've been with me this whole time, to unanimous consent. And I wondered then and now, how the can this be constitutional? Because you know I'm that nerd that has a well-worn copy of the Constitution that has traveled with me to all my homes for many years. And Section 5 says, quote, each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business, unquote. Passing bills is doing business. A quorum is the minimum number of members that have to be present to pass bills. And so it seems pretty clear to me that, quote, a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business, unquote, means that more than half the members have to be present to do business, to pass bills. But you just heard for yourself, bills are passing through damn near empty rooms. Now, the Stock Act gutting was the first time I saw it, but it's actually routine. They do this all the time. All that is required in reality is one member of Congress to play speaker and one to present the bill to the empty room. Somehow that's being considered a quorum, even though there's no majority of members anywhere to be found in that room. Well, during the debates about the changes the Democrats would make to the House rules, I found out where unanimous consent came from. It was in a situation very, very similar to the one we found ourselves in today. Here's the chairman of the Rules Committee, Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts.
The process of unanimous consent, that is allowing bills to pass with just two members in the chamber, was developed in response to the Spanish flu pandemic, despite the Constitution requiring a majority of members to conduct business. In both the House and the Senate, you see to this day.
And so a pandemic over 100 years ago prompted the Congress to make an emergency change to the rules, and those rules that seem to go against the Constitution are still being used today to pass bills all the time. But when it's used in a day-to-day situation, in non-emergency times, even if one member objects to unanimous consent being used, then the process is killed and they have to find another way to pass the bill. But the emergency rule that was on the books up until 6 weeks ago, that rule created by the Republicans after 9/11, would change the definition of a quorum in the case of an emergency so that essentially unanimous consent could be used with no method to kill it. In an emergency, the definition of a quorum, the minimum number of members needed to be present to pass a bill, which would be half according to that pesky Constitution, well, in an emergency situation, that could be lowered. Here's Jim McGovern.
The gentleman referred to the change that was implemented after 9/11, when the Republicans were in charge of the House. And in 2005, you changed the rules for a provisional quorum, which would allow in the extreme 2 members to constitute a quorum. Now, the Constitution, defines a quorum as the majority of the membership. But under the rules change that was done back then, you literally could have 2 members constitute a quorum. I don't think that's constitutional. But nonetheless, that was the plan that was put forward. And yeah, it may have taken a long time to put forward, but I don't really think it was a very good plan.
So that post 9/11 rule that the Republicans put into effect and that the Democrats left in place despite having control of the House for 3 Congresses since then. Well, the rule said that this process could be used only after 96 hours of attempts to gather were impossible due to, quote, natural disaster, attack, contagion, or similar calamity rendering representatives incapable of attending the proceedings of the House, unquote. No situation has met those criteria since that emergency rule was placed on the books in 2005, and the courts aren't allowed to rule on hypotheticals, and so the constitutionality of that rule is untested. In theory, this is the rule that should be governing this emergency if travel to D.C. were impossible. But there's the rub. More than half of the members of Congress have successfully made it back to Washington, D.C. to vote since the COVID crisis began. For example, in episode 212, I told you about the process that passed the CARES Act. The CARES Act episode detailing what was in that law was episode 213. But in the episode about the first two COVID response laws and the process for the CARES Act, episode 212, I showed you how one representative, Tom Massey of Kentucky, drove from Kentucky to D.C. to try and stop the CARES Act from being passed using the unanimous consent of an empty House. Because Tom Massey had the courage to object to a multi-trillion-dollar, poorly thought-through bill becoming law without a debate or vote, members of Congress had to physically get their asses back to D.C. to pass it. Tom Massey was able to stop the unanimous consent method from being used because a single member can object by correctly pointing out that a quorum is not present if the room is empty, and so unanimous consent was not allowed. And so the way the CARES Act was passed was by voice vote. When this method is used, a quorum needs to be present, so more than half of the members of the House need to be in the room. When the person with the gavel asks for the yeses and no votes out loud, everyone then shouts their votes. And the gavel guy or girl then says which they think had the most support. And in the case of the CARES Act, they said it was the yeses. Massey then asked for a recorded vote, but that requires a fifth of the people there to have his back and to stand to request a recorded vote with him. And even though I know for a fact that C-SPAN has asked for the ability to show who is in the room, to have control of the cameras for years, I know this because the founder of C-SPAN told me himself. But Nancy Pelosi won't let C-SPAN control the camera, and so we have no way to know who was in the room and who stood up. But what we know for sure is that it wasn't enough people, and the CARES Act passed without a recorded vote of who showed up to vote and how they voted. Which shows us that we're being governed by selfish cowards. But to the point of this episode, it also shows that it has not been impossible for a quorum to show up to D.C. to vote. Travel is less convenient, but there is nothing preventing people from driving to Washington, D.C. The only voting representatives that truly need to fly are those from Hawaii. Hawaii has 2 representatives. Because 49 out of the 50 United States are physically attached to D.C. via the U.S. and Canada's highway systems, which means that it is possible for 433 out of the 435 members of the House to get their asses back to D.C. right now. And yet travel was the reason cited by Democrats over and over again as the reason that they had to change the emergency rules during this particular emergency in order for votes to happen. Here's the number 2 Democrat in the House, Representative Steny Hoyer of Maryland.
Because of social and physical distancing measures currently in place to save lives and prevent the spread of COVID-19, it is unsafe for members to travel back and forth to Washington from their districts and risk exposing potentially thousands of people while in transit.
Here's Representative Earl Perlmutter of Colorado, also a Democrat.
But we cannot have government come to a grinding halt. And a pandemic where our own attending physician or our public health experts at home or the public health experts here in D.C. say, you guys shouldn't get together because you could drag the disease from Denver to D.C. or you could take the disease from D.C. back to Denver. And that's the last thing I want to do.
And here's Representative Norma Torres of California.
I have a pre-existing condition, and when I got on the plane yesterday, I was scared to death. There were people in the screening area of the TSA process that were much too close for my own comfort. And I had made a commitment to my staff, to my family, that if that plane was more than 70% occupied and there were people, stepping over each other, that I would immediately get off of it before taking off. Because I am not willing to risk my life for this.
They don't want to travel back and forth, either because they're concerned with contracting or transmitting the virus, or because they're cowards like Norma Torres, who, even though she's a member of Congress who funds wars and sends others to risk their lives for their countries routinely, refuses to take any risk upon herself. But here's a novel thought. They don't have to travel back and forth from their homes to D.C. They can stay in D.C. and do their fucking jobs. Every member of Congress gets a minimum wage of $174,000 per year. Some of them have made the choice to sleep in their offices during their work week and fly home every single weekend to save money. But we do pay them enough that they can afford a small apartment in Washington, D.C. and have $150,000 a year left over. When in Washington, D.C., to keep them safe, they can do what they've already done to conduct their business. They can vote in shifts on the House floor. It does take longer, but if they were staying in DC full time just during this emergency, then they could use Mondays and Fridays to actually work instead of travel, and God forbid, maybe even work on a weekend. This is an emergency after all. We also have things called tests. We could test our members of Congress as much as necessary. Although this group of Democrats in Congress don't seem to realize the importance of the jobs we have elected them to do, because here's the chairman of the Rules Committee, Jim McGovern.
And then his alternative, which I think incorporates some of the things that are in the press release that you guys released, was that, we should operate like the White House and we all should get tested. We all should move to the front of the line. We're all special enough that even though our constituents can't get tests, people who work in hospitals, first responders, people who are working in food pantries and in homeless shelters, who quite frankly should be tested, that Congress, the way we can kind of manage this is we all come back and every time we come into session we'll get tested. I don't know what the reaction would be in the minority leaders district, but in my district people think that's tone deaf and think it's wrong, that we're not super special, that we should move to the front of the line.
So I'll give you that each individual human in the 116th Congress in particular is not super special. I'll give you that because we know for a fact that many of these particular humans in this particular Congress are idiots, hypocrites, and cowards. However, the positions they hold, the jobs of writing national laws and determining where all our tax money goes during an unprecedented pandemic, those jobs are super special. The people holding these essential jobs should absolutely go to the front of the line for tests if needed, just like the president and vice president do. But the truth of the matter is that travel is possible right now, and you don't even have to be all that creative to come up with the ways. Cars. Use cars. And if they can't drive themselves for whatever reason, let's COVID test them a driver. Literally 99.5% of the members of the House can physically get to Washington, D.C. using cars. And then they can stay there in D.C. and use the exact same voting procedures that they've already used to vote in a way that we know is constitutionally sound. But the truth is that they simply don't want to. Here is Steny Hoyer, the number 2 Democrat again.
Why are we acting quickly? Because the experts tell us, and some people believe the experts, that this may regenerate itself in September. We may have a flattening, but until, frankly, we get a vaccine or a therapeutic that very substantially minimizes the consequences of COVID-19, we're going to have a problem. And if it raises again its ugly head in September, we ought to be ready. Because September is going to be a very busy month for us. And we don't have a lot. It's an election year, so we're going to be off in October, et cetera, et cetera. So now is the time that you say we moved quickly. We did move quickly because we need to anticipate. We all hope this gets better. We all hope we get a vaccine. We all hope we get a therapeutic. But if it doesn't, we need to be ready to make sure that Congress is empowered to act on behalf of the American people and to conduct oversight.
We're going to have a busy September because we're going to be off in October. Oh, really? Because that's a choice. You don't have to be off in October. You have the option to stay in D.C. and do your jobs. And that goes for August, too, another full month that they're planning to be home for. That's a choice. The Democrats control the schedule. And they are clearly concerned that conducting their business in person will be a slow process. Here's Jim McGovern.
This is the Rules Committee, right? We are one of the smallest committees in Congress, and here we are taking up the entire Ways and Means Committee room, which is one of the biggest committee rooms in Congress. What do you do with the Transportation Committee and the Appropriations Committee, which, is significantly larger? Some have suggested that maybe they can meet in the auditorium or maybe on the House floor, one at a time. I mean, we have a huge amount of work to do. There are, in addition to responding to this crisis and trying to figure out how to get the economy back on its feet again, we have must-pass bills that we need to get done. I mean, defense authorization bills, appropriations bills. I mean, and the fact that we cannot function, our committee process just literally can't function the way it should if we're going to follow CDC guidelines, I mean, that is problematic. So what do? We don't meet. We don't address certain issues that need to be addressed.
No, you can take more time for meetings. You can use the bigger committee rooms on nights and weekends. You can take votes slower. And you can work in August and October to make up the difference. Like I said, the solutions are there. You don't even have to be all that creative to come up with them. And even though they'll deny it, here's Steny Hoyer.
We are not fundamentally changing the way the House works. Let me be clear. We are not changing. There is no advantage to Democrats, no disadvantage to Republicans by using virtual technology. None. Zero, zip.
They say there's no political calculations going on here, but when it comes to proxy voting, there is. Because one of the downsides listed by the House Rules Committee report of continuing to vote in person on the House floor is that if the majority party, the Democrats, full of cowards, didn't come back to work, then the minority party, the Republicans, the ones being reckless with COVID-19, they could have the majority of votes, quote, which would not reflect the outcome of the latest election, unquote. And it's worth pointing out that all the arguments I'm making about the ability for the House to do its work in D.C. safely are contingent upon the 435 members of the House behaving like adults by wearing masks and keeping their distance from each other. And while I am clearly, you can sense the attitude, disgusted with the Democrats for being cowards and for prioritizing their vacations over their jobs, they do have probable cause to fear their Republican colleagues behaving like ignorant children and refusing to minimize their COVID transmission risks because they've been doing it for months. For example, here's Republican Representative Tom McClintock on June 17th, speaking indoors without a mask to Democratic Representative Gerald Nadler, whose wife is battling cancer.
You choose to wear a mask, sir. I do not. I ask you to respect my choice as I respect yours.
It is not your choice to obey the decorum of the House. Mr. Chairman, I don't yield my time. I consider masks much more effective at spreading panic and much less effective at stopping a virus for anyone who's under 50 and healthy is less severe than the flu.
And this behavior continued over a week later on June 26th in a meeting of the Coronavirus Committee when every Republican, every one of them, refused to wear masks. Here's the discussion between the 79-year-old cancer survivor chairman, Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, and the maskless Republican Representative Mark Green of Tennessee.
You've asked, Mr. Ranking Member, that we have meetings in person. We have accommodated you. I would love for us to abide by the attending physician's recommendations.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
But point of order. The CDC has said 6 foot social distancing. You don't need a mask. We are 6 feet apart. We don't need a mask. When I came in today, I put my mask on because I walked past people. Now that I'm in a seat, I don't need a mask.
Which just straight up isn't true. Indoors, masks needed. It's basic. And even in July, reporters are noting Republicans in the House refusing to wear masks while at work. Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana, Clay Higgins of Louisiana, Ted Yoho of Florida, Michael Guest of Mississippi, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, Don Young of Alaska, Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, and Andy Biggs of COVID Petri Dish, Arizona. Even though there is a basket of free masks available to them sitting in the House. So even if the Republicans are right, and I think they are, in principle, to argue that travel is not impossible and the rules for voting on the House floor should not have been changed, their behavior has increased the risk to everyone who works on Capitol Hill, the members of Congress, and the staff. And so it's tough to claim the high road when being so reckless, and it does lend some validity to the Democrats' fears. But every one of these people swore an oath to defend the Constitution, which is more important than their fears. And so despite the Republicans' immature behavior, because travel is possible, the criteria for emergency procedures for House floor voting were not supposed to go into effect. Which is good because that rule that the Repubs wrote, even some Republicans think it's probably unconstitutional. In the hearing about the rules changes, Democrat Jamie Raskin spoke to a panel of Republican congressmen who are objecting to the proxy voting proposals. And here's an edited version of their conversation. I took out some babbling from Mike Pence's idiot brother Greg and I just edited it so that they get to the point. But the timestamp is in the show notes if you want to hear what they said in full.
Mr. Cole posed an interesting question to the panel about whether all of you concurred that you think that the proposed rule here is unconstitutional, and each one of you in seriatim repeated the idea that you thought it was unconstitutional. Now, Mr. Byrne has candidly volunteered that the current rule adopted by a Republican Congress is unconstitutional, which would allow 2 members to constitute a quorum. Mr. Jordan, what about you? Do you agree the current rule is unconstitutional?
As the gentleman well knows, my colleagues in the Freedom Caucus have come to the floor and objected to unanimous consent to pass certain legislation.
So you agree with Mr. Byrne?
We've always had a problem with that.
So you agree? I'm just a yes or no question. Do you agree with Mr. Byrne it's unconstitutional?
Yeah, I don't like the rule. We've been very clear about that.
You agree it's unconstitutional? Okay. Is that right? Okay. Mr. Byrne, you presumably still agree that it's unconstitutional?
Yes, sir. I think if you're going to be consistent, you have to follow what the Constitution requires, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Mr. Bishop, do you believe...
consistent around here, but I try to be consistent.
Mr. Bishop, do you believe the current rule is unconstitutional, adopted under a Republican Congress?
Carefully, but I find Mr. Burns' comments and those that have been made by the chairman on the point persuasive. It probably is unconstitutional.
Okay.
So the old rule with questionable constitutionality never needed to be used. And it certainly didn't need to be replaced with a rule equally constitutionally questionable. But that's what the Democrats did. And so the new rules that the Democrats put in place allow proxy voting on the floor of the House of Representatives. And like I said before, this is unprecedented, as in it has never been allowed in the entire history of the United States Congress on neither the House nor Senate floors. I've outlined the resolution that changed the rules for you in this episode's show notes, so you can check all of this out for yourself. But here's the Cliff Notes version of the new rules. The way this works is that if a member doesn't want to drive to Washington, D.C. to do their jobs, that member can choose another member to vote for them on the floor of the House. The member who is not there, but who chooses another member to vote for them, does count towards a quorum. And this is important because the Constitution says that a majority of members in the House constitutes a quorum. And when it comes to recording votes, it measures the number of measures, quote, present, unquote. So the constitutionality of this hinges largely on the definition of present. Is someone present if they're texting in their votes from thousands of miles away? Well, the number 2 Democrat in the House, Steny Hoyer, thinks so.
Because I believe that being virtually present and being present is essentially the same thing in the constitutional consequences of that presence. Because I can vote aye here and I can vote aye 1,000 miles away. And it has the same representation of my constituents. It's just it's transmitted in a different way.
And I see the logic there. But our entire history as a country, including during this pandemic up until this rule change, present has meant physically at the vote. And I can't tell you how a judge would rule on the definition of present here, which is kind of the entire point. But anyway, constitutional or not, this is allowed now. And so the way it works is that when the member who is phoning it in chooses their proxy, they have to submit a signed letter to the clerk of the House with the name of their proxy. There's no requirement that this letter be notarized or that a witness sign it, and the letter can be an email. When the clerk of the House receives the letter, the clerk has to notify the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, the Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, and the, quote, members involved, unquote. But if the missing member does decide to grace the House of Representatives with their presence after the letter is submitted, then the proxy designation is automatically revoked. Now, to keep track of all this, the clerk of the House has to maintain an updated list of the proxy designations and publish them online. And I've included a link to that list for you in the show notes. And in reality, the clerk is publishing the proxy letters themselves. There are 2 lists, one of all the proxy letters that have been submitted since May 22nd when this started, and a list of active proxy letters. But the list isn't exactly what I was expecting. The list doesn't say who is serving as a proxy for who. If you want to know who is serving as a proxy for the absentee representatives, you have to open each individual letter, which matters because a member who does show up for work can be a proxy for up to 10 missing members. And so there's some busy work involved in figuring out who is voting for multiple people. But the bigger picture issue with this is this math, which was done by Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio.
And understand what's in this proposal. 1 member can have 10 proxies. You know what that means? 22 members with 10 proxies in their back pocket can conduct the business of the American people. 5% of the United States House of Representatives.
And it brings back that whole question again about what did the Constitution mean when it required half the House to constitute a quorum to do business? Because 5% is far from half. But anyway, putting aside the Constitution, just like the Democrats did, the process for voting is that before casting a vote for another member, the physically present member has to, quote, obtain an exact instruction, unquote, from the missing member in regards to the vote or quorum call. How that exact instruction has to be transmitted isn't defined, which brings me to the tech. When it comes to how the members communicate with their proxies, that's left up to them, which I consider a problem because we want to make sure that the person transmitting the vote is actually the missing member of Congress. Because you don't have to be a criminal mastermind to envision a way to weekend at Bernie's this situation. First step, break into the congressman's home and knock out the congressman. Then forge a letter designating a proxy. They didn't make it all that hard. Then use the member's cell phone to text the proxy the vote. This new rule didn't require the vote to be transmitted via video, and they didn't require a live feed to make sure the congressman is watching or even alive during the vote. But then on top of that, remember the new rules weren't just about proxy voting. This was a package of rule changes that included the authorization for conducting remote hearings, which includes remote voting in those hearings. Voting in committees, it's not as big of a deal as voting on the House floor because no bill that passes a committee can, pass go and directly into law. But still, usually votes are conducted in person. And this rule change requires technology to play middleman between a missing member of Congress and their vote. And so the security and reliability of that technology is important. And this rule change requires the chair of the House Administration Committee, Representative Zoe Lofgren of California, to choose the technology that's going to be used and certify what she chooses is operational and secure. And so here's problem number one with that. Here's Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma.
The rules change we are considering today will allow for remote voting to take effect without an additional vote of the House, and instead only upon certification of technology by one member, Chairperson Lofgren. This is ceding the authority of the Rules Committee, and it denies the entire House deliberation on the technology and a vote on making such a consequential change.
Which is true. One person shouldn't be making this decision by herself. And there's also the issue of who this one particular person is in this moment. Like I said, the chair of the House Administration Committee is Zoe Lofgren. Zoe Lofgren represents California's 19th district, which includes a good chunk of the San Jose, Santa Clara area, otherwise known as Silicon Valley, where the world's largest tech companies are located. She has a bachelor's degree in political science and has a law degree from Santa Clara University School of Law, and she used that law degree to practice immigration law. Now, all of that is fine, except Zoe Lofgren has no expertise in technology. She represents the big tech businesses that make up Silicon Valley, but that doesn't qualify her to be the only person who gets to choose and certify the security of any technology. And I'm going to go here, even though it always pisses the boomers off. But Zoe Lofgren is 72 years old. She's not a member of the most tech-savvy generation in the most tech-savvy Congress. And I'm not saying anything that's not being acknowledged within this Congress itself. Here's Jim McGovern.
Proposing that we take a baby step, that we go with a low-tech approach first, and as we feel more comfortable, we can evolve. This may shock you, Mr. Woodall, but there are some members of the House who still have flip phones. There are some members of this chamber who are more technologically comfortable than others. There are some members of this House who think bifocals are a radical idea. So, the bottom line is we are trying to deal with the situation in a way that we feel that there's a comfort level, and as people get more comfortable, we can then look at other things.
And the tech they're kicking around, here's number 2 Democrat in the House, 81-year-old Steny Hoyer.
My own view, I will tell you honestly, is that the best way for me to convey my vote is to look into my phone on FaceTime and say I vote aye or nay. I personally don't believe there's a security question.
FaceTime. Here's an example of an issue with FaceTime. Last year, 2019, Apple confirmed that all the iPhones that were running 4 versions of its operating system were vulnerable to the easiest FaceTime hack ever. In this case, if you had an iPhone for a short period of time, you could use FaceTime to hear or see another iPhone user without that person accepting your call. All you had to do was start a FaceTime call, add your own number to the FaceTime call as if you were creating a group FaceTime message, and then the call would connect, even if the person that you called never accepted it. Now, if you didn't follow that, it doesn't matter because Apple fixed it. But the point is that every time any phone or iPad or computer's operating system is updated, funky bugs like this can and do happen. No tech is truly secure. And our Congress is staffed by a lot of elderly people, only one of whom is being given the power to certify the tech. I'm not all that confident that they're the people that are going to know about all of these problems with all the different tech. I want AOC and Justin Amash and the youngins in this Congress to be in on these decisions. And this rule keeps them and 99.8% of the House of Representatives out of the room when the tech decisions about remote voting are being made. That is a poorly designed process. But back to the proxy voting on the House floor, like I said before, there's no requirement in the rule that passed governing how the missing member must transfer their vote to the physically present proxy member. Any rules that will be established about this will be done via regulation by the chairman of the Rules Committee, Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. Now, it's no secret that I like Jim McGovern. Back in 2013, 2014, when I was reading every bill that passed the House of Representatives, there were dozens of times that Jim McGovern, a total process wonk, explained to the three of us who were watching Congress why seemingly scandalous things were happening. He taught me about dingleberries. He taught me about unanimous consent. I've been watching the guy govern for 8 years now, and so even though I disagree with many of the decisions he has made, especially on this topic today, I do trust that his intentions are good. But to change the way the House votes in such an unprecedented way, the details should have been worked out in full and voted on by the full House. It's not appropriate to leave any of this up to regulation. Regulations can be changed on a whim by one person, and that one person might not always be Jim McGovern. And so right now, it doesn't matter that I like the guy. There's precedent being set here. And when it comes to how the missing members transmit their votes to their proxies, that's an essential part of this rule that's missing. Because going back to my terrorist fantasy, let's say that happened. Let's say there was a coordinated attack and 5 missing congressmen were incapacitated at home and the bad guys told the proxies to vote the wrong way. Because the safeguards for wrong votes is supposed to be that the proxy member has to announce the vote that they will cast for the missing member out loud. But what if the missing member isn't listening because they're unconscious? Or what if the missing members trusted a douchebag as their proxy and the proxy intentionally votes the wrong way? What happens if the vote is cast wrong on the floor of the House, either because the wrong vote was sent to the proxy or because the proxy is a dick? Well, Representative Rob Woodall went down that rabbit hole with number 2 Democrat Steny Hoyer, one of the architects of this rule change, during the Rules Committee hearing.
And it says specifically, a member casting a vote or recording the presence of another member as a designated proxy under this resolution shall cast such vote or record such presence pursuant to the exact instruction received from the other member. Now, when Mr. Davis's name is called and I'm holding his proxy and I speak out and vote in a way contrary to the Davis instruction, because things do come up on the fly and not everything can be consulted with, what is the procedure for resolving that?
The theory, not the theory, but I think the letter of the rule that's being proposed is if you did not get instructions, you could not vote that proxy.
I'm going the other direction. I did receive instructions, and I'm voting against those instructions, just like in the Electoral College, where folks have received instructions to vote for President Trump, but they don't. What is my recourse as a member? Again, most solemn responsibility we have as members is voting on the House floor. What is my recourse?
Madam Clerk, he cast my vote incorrectly. You can email, you can text, you can call. There's so many different methods of technology.
And then Representative Jim McGovern, who's the chairman of the committee, he then piped in.
If you are if you're trying to assert that Mr. Hoyer would deliberately try to take your vote and use it in a bad way, then that's a question of privilege, and you would have the opportunity to be able to correct it. So that there's you hopefully, if you're participating remotely, you are following what is going on. You will hear your name announced. You will hear how you voted. And if you call and Mr. Hoyer doesn't want to change your vote, then it's a question of privilege, and you have the right to be able to change it that way.
We're resting on a hopefully here. because both of them assume that the missing member is watching the vote and able to communicate with their proxy. The idea that the out-of-sight member could possibly be forced to send a wrong vote to a proxy wasn't even considered. This was the only hearing on this rushed rule change that took place, and so if it were considered, it would have been here, and so that's not good. But Woodall continued with the question of what if the proxy votes the wrong way? Because both paths lead to the same place. What happens if the wrong vote is cast? This is Woodall continuing his conversation with number 2 Democrat Steny Hoyer.
I recognize in the public domain we have more opportunities than ever before to correct errors, and I can be certain that with Mr. Davis's vast digital presence, he will tell all of his constituents that I voted the wrong way for him. But the law of the land will have changed because I voted the proxy my way instead of his way. There is no mechanism for reconsideration. As I read the resolution, we do have votes that hinge on a one-vote margin day in and day out. How do we anticipate correcting not the understanding of someone's constituents, but the direction of public policy for the greatest country the world has ever known?
Can I suggest that is one of the reasons the rule provides for alternatives, and we ought to be talking about what those alternatives are that both of us believe give us a sense of confidence. This is a first step. I think it is a credible step. It is something that has been used and is used. The contingency that you raise is certainly possible. I think we all have to recognize that. And it's certainly possible that any contingency might have technological glitches as we move forward. And we'll have to consider making accommodations for that we otherwise might not have thought of.
The contingency is certainly possible, and we'll have to consider making accommodations for that later. What? No! You have to make accommodations for that now. You have to put safeguards in for that before a law is inappropriately signed. You have to avoid a constitutional crisis, not deal with it when it arrives. When I was considering whether or not to go forward with this episode, because I know this is all kinds of wonky and people won't listen and I won't make any money on this episode, but that moment, that sealed it for me. That's proof that they haven't thought this through. And when really important holes in their plan were pointed out, they did jack shit about it. At least some of us in America have to know what kind of constitutional clusterfuck is possible now that proxy voting is allowed. And speaking of when proxy voting is allowed, when exactly is it allowed according to these new rules? Well, the new rules allow the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to decide when to allow proxy voting. But one other person does get a say. Nancy Pelosi can only declare proxy voting allowed if the Sergeant at Arms says that, quote, a public emergency due to a novel coronavirus is in effect, unquote. The Sergeant at Arms has to, quote, consult, unquote, with the attending physician, but the ultimate determination on if there is or is not an emergency rests with him, not the doctor or the Speaker of the House, which kind of makes the Sergeant at Arms the most powerful person here. And who the fuck is that, you say? Well, the Sergeant at Arms is basically the unelected head security guard at the House of Representatives. He's chosen by the members of the House, not members of the public. Right now, in the House of Representatives, the Sergeant at Arms is Paul Irving, who's had the job since the beginning of 2012. Before being chosen by that Republican-dominated Congress to be the #1 congressional hall monitor, he worked at the Secret Service at the White House during the W. Bush years. During the 4-year gap between protecting W and becoming the head of law enforcement in the House, he slid into the role of president and managing partner of his family's real estate investment firm. Because we all have one of those to fall back on, right? He also joined Command Consulting Group, which is a multinational company that creates security plans for foreign governments and billionaires. So while voting by proxy is ultimately Nancy Pelosi's decision, she can't do it without this guy declaring an emergency, which gives him, some unelected, filthy rich real estate heir, enormous power over how the House of Representatives creates national laws. Not at all as the Constitution commanded. But here we go. That's how it is. And so when proxy voting is declared allowed by a Irving-Pelosi partnership, it'll be allowed for 45 days at a time, and then the permission expires. Unless the Speaker of the House decides to extend it for an additional 45 days. And there are no limits on how often this can be done. And it's already been extended once. Proxy voting is now officially okie dokie until August 8th at least. That is, of course, unless the Sergeant at Arms says that the emergency is no longer in effect, in which case the Speaker of the House has to stop allowing proxy voting. So again, the Sergeant at Arms is given power over the Speaker of the House, which is nuts. Couldn't the members of the House at least vote on whether emergency conditions are being met? Why does one dude get to decide what is and what is not an emergency? And this is a symptom of a problem that we've witnessed in Congress for a long, long time. We're talking decades. These fuckers in Congress really need to be much more responsible about emergency declarations. I mean, we know that we have state of emergencies that have been going on for decades in countries around the world justifying all kinds of war activities. Like the 9/11 state of emergency. That's still current. They built a whole new tower at Ground Zero, but the 9/11 state of emergency ongoing. It's absurd. Nancy Pelosi's generation of Congress members have been playing recklessly with the definition of emergency for decades, reining none of the abuses of emergency powers in. And now this. No vote on if a situation meets the criteria for an emergency that requires proxy voting. Just Pelosi and an unelected security guard get to decide. And you can probably hear the suspicion in my voice about all of this. And it's because of the first 3 COVID response laws. Pelosi, pretty much alone, got to write the first one. We don't know who was in the room with her because members of Congress were at home. And I said in one or more of my thank you episode rants about the House being MIA for the first 2 months of COVID. But you can't bang on closed doors from thousands of miles away. She does get power in this situation. Allowing members to stay at home gives her power to determine who gets consulted on decisions, who gets to be in the room. And this remote stuff, microphones for pesky members can be muted. The connection's accidentally lost. It gives her the power to determine which of our representatives gets to speak when work is done remotely. And members who aren't physically there can't make a fuss about shenanigans they can't see. This is why it's important for members to be required to be physically there, even if they don't want to. Because, for example, we've seen Justin Amash run into the Rules Committee to raise awareness about a horrible dingleberry on a funding law, hidden over 1,000 pages deep in a bill being rushed into law on Christmas week. We know the leadership of both parties operate like that, Republicans and Democrats. We've seen it. Both parties, we have now confirmed on this podcast, work around the rules, following the letter of the rules and laws, but not the intents. There's an important element to members of Congress physically congregating to vote. Even with socially distanced voting procedures, a Justin Amash could stand 20 feet from the walkway, holding a sign, and make sure that everyone in the House is aware of some evil secret hitchhiking into law if they're all physically there. I don't know how he could possibly force anyone to pay attention to him over Zoom. And so being physically there, I think that's how the House is supposed to function. I think that's the intent. At least I know that's how I want it to function. And my representative is granted no vote on when this fundamental part of lawmaking is tossed aside on a case-by-case basis. And that's some bullshit. And some members of Congress can smell it. Here's Representative Bradley Byrne of Alabama.
We're living in a house where the work product is coming from the very top and being thrown upon the rest of us. And we're abdicating our responsibility to legislate. If we're honest with ourselves, I believe no one would challenge me when I say the rights and individual prerogatives of the members of the House have been steadily shrinking for decades. It was true when the chairman eloquently made this point when he was the ranking member of this committee, and it's just as true today. Too much power has been taken away from individual members and committees of jurisdiction and transferred to the office of the Speaker. With all due respect, this proposal today reinforces what is fast becoming a complete transfer of the power of the institution to the Speaker.
And I'm concerned about that same exact thing. We saw the power Speaker Pelosi commanded for the COVID-19 response laws, which shows us not only that she's perfectly happy being a one-woman House of Representatives, but also that she's terrible at it. She surrendered the writing of the CARES Act to Mitch McConnell and the foreclosure profiteer Steve Mnuchin. And of course, that resulted in a law that gave trillions of dollars to the investor class from the Federal Reserve. The NASDAQ hit a new high yesterday. Yippee! While the rest of us were supposed to survive the entire pandemic on a one-time $1,200 check. Or take out a one-time only loan, which the private banks get paid billions to play gatekeepers on. Under Nancy's leadership, the House has been essentially shut down. They write bills they know are going nowhere. They don't fight for the individual pieces that could and should become law. House subpoenas are routinely ignored, and the COVID response laws have left my representative, and likely yours, on the sideline. You know, we each get to elect someone to represent us for a reason. I didn't elect Nancy Pelosi. We can blame the financial district in San Francisco for continuing to do that. I elected Barbara Lee, and I want her in the fucking room, unless that is literally impossible, which right now, get in your car! It's not. But that's not even the most important thing here, even though our representation existing is pretty damn important. This is the most important thing here. Here's Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma.
I have real concerns about whether or not any system of remote voting or proxy voting is constitutional. The language of the Constitution clearly contemplates members being physically present in the chamber to conduct business. A move to any other kind of procedure that involves members not being physically present in the chamber to vote and to make a quorum will put the legislation passed by those methods at risk of court challenges.
Now, it would be one thing if they had limited what could be voted on with a constitutionally questionable, quickly crafted proxy voting plan. The truth of the matter is that the only things that they really have to do before the end of this year, the bare minimum, is that they have to fund the government and they have to authorize the wars. And they don't really have to do that second one, but I'm being practical here. They could limit proxy voting to those essential bills and bills related to pandemic response. So at least the damage done would be minimized in case the courts don't do what the Democrats' crystal balls say. Because the Democrats are taking an educated guess as to how the courts would handle a challenge to their proxy voting plan, a court challenge that already exists. The House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, and a bunch of other Republicans have already filed a lawsuit against proxy voting. The Republican lawsuit says, quote, in the 231-year existence of the United States Congress, neither the House of Representatives nor the Senate has ever permitted a member to vote by proxy from the floor of the chamber, unquote. Now, this fact doesn't mean that the rule is necessarily unconstitutional, but what it does mean is that the courts have never determined constitutionality of the idea because they're not allowed to rule on hypotheticals. Now that this is being used in the House, it's not a hypothetical anymore, and the courts are going to have to rule on it because of the Republicans' lawsuit. Now, looking at the congressional record, it was the Democrats that appeared to submit the most letters from constitutional scholars saying their proxy voting scheme would survive in court. And so here's a sample of what those letters said. Here's Representative Jim McGovern.
To submit to the record a letter from Erwin Chemerinsky, the renowned constitutional expert and dean of Berkeley School of Law, discussing that view that remote voting process we're considering today would in fact be constitutional. In the letter, the dean says, and I quote, the Constitution bestows on each House of Congress broad discretion to determine the rules for its own proceedings. This authority is expansive and would include the ability to adopt a rule to permit proxy voting. Nothing in the Constitution specifies otherwise. Moreover, if this were challenged in court, it is very likely that the case would be dismissed as a political question. The Supreme Court has ruled that challenges to the internal operation of the Congress are not justiciable in the federal courts.
And so there is cause, educated cause, to reasonably think that the Republican lawsuit could get thrown out because the Supreme Court has ruled on something similar. The Supreme Court ruled in a case in 1892 about whether or not members who were in the room for a vote but didn't actually vote counted towards a quorum. The Supreme Court essentially refused to answer and instead said, quote, the Constitution has prescribed no method of making this determination, and it is therefore within the competency of the House to prescribe any method which shall be reasonably certain to ascertain the fact, unquote. And so the House Democrats are betting that the Supreme Court would do the same thing with legal challenges to their proxy voting rule. But the more concerning constitutional court challenges would come in response to any laws that are passed using this, because harm has to be reasonably claimed in order for those kinds of cases to go forward, and that can't really be claimed with the House Republican lawsuit. Because this plan has its many flaws, but the House Republicans have the choice to be in the House to vote, and so they aren't being, disenfranchised or anything. But what if proxy voting is used to pass a law that changes tax law, for example? And I've seen tax dingleberries on every single government funding law, so this is likely. If someone can prove that they were financially harmed by the changes, they could sue and claim that the process used to craft the law was unconstitutional. And then we're back to the definition of present again. What if this Supreme Court that has surprised all the crystal balls these last few months rules that present means present, physically there? Every law passed using this process would be called into question. What laws are valid? How do we sort this out? Who sorts that out? Can you imagine the clusterfuck that would cause by not knowing what laws are valid? It's a dangerous prediction the Democrats are making, that the courts will rule in their favor. In order to create emergency rules out of thin air during an emergency so that 70 or so of their members don't have to take a long drive or miss family time during their expected 2 months of paid vacation. Because even if the courts allow this, the process itself, I clearly don't approve of. The Speaker does get too much power. The random-ass Sergeant-at-Arms gets too much power. Zoe Lofgren gets too much power of the tech choices. Jim McGovern gets too much power in making the regulations by himself. My representative is not permitted to vote on any of these decisions nearly enough. And this sets precedent. Here's Representative Steny Hoyer.
And we ought to all be committed that we would only use it in extraordinary circumstances. I don't believe there's been such a circumstance in the United States of America since 1918, over 100 years ago. This may be once in a century experience for our country.
1918, the last great pandemic, when that Congress pulled the idea of unanimous consent out of their asses. And 102 years later, we're still using it. That's what precedent looks like. Here's Tom Cole of Oklahoma.
Though the changes are purportedly limited to the present COVID-19 pandemic timeline, the temporary change we make to the rules today becomes the precedent we follow tomorrow.
And like it or not, here we go. Because when this crossed my radar at all in the mainstream press, the story was more like, hey, look, the House is doing this new thing. The country just isn't aware of these nuances. If this goes the bad way, most everyone outside of this audience and Jesse Ventura's audience, because I'm going to go on his show in mid-July to talk about this. But the just about all Americans that don't regularly tune into those two shows don't know that the House is playing with legislative fire. And if the courts surprise the Democrats, the whole country will be blindsided. And so we better hope the definition of present includes not being present. But basically, where we are as of this recording in almost the middle of July is that this rules package passed the House on May 15th with 98.6% of Democrats and 0% of Republicans and independents agreeing to it. The first proxy votes were cast on May 27th when 72 Democrats from 19 states voted by proxy for the first time in U.S. history. The states with the most members voting by proxy were in this order: California, which had 26, Florida had 8, Texas had 6, New York, definitely driving distance, had 5, and Illinois had 4. Like I said before, the rules place no limits on laws passed via proxy, and so the first item on the agenda that the House Democrats intended to use proxy voting for was the FISA reauthorization, reauthorizing spying powers for Donald Trump that expired back in March, laws that have been constitutionally questionable since they were written by the Patriot Act, and so why not add some gray to the area? Luckily, they didn't end up voting on the bill after a lot of Republicans indicated that they would vote against it and kill it because it contained an amendment that would have limited the Trump administration's ability to collect our internet browsing histories. Which means that since March 15th, the ability of the government to digitally spy on us has been legally limited. But have they stopped any of the currently illegal spying? I know that Congress will just fucking backdate the authorities for Trump, but right now, isn't it illegal to use those provisions? But does the law matter when Trump keeps breaking it? Like when he used chemical gases on peaceful protesters to clear his way for a weird photo op on live TV with the Attorney General watching? You know, at this point, what are laws anymore? And I say this because I was going to do an episode on the FISA thing, but after 3 days of researching it, I just kind of sat back and realized, what's the point? The Democrats want to give him that power, and the resistance is an obvious joke on this one, has been for years. But the main point, as far as this episode is concerned, is that the Democrats intend to use proxy voting for laws routine and controversial, and they prove that right out of the gate. But we congressional dishers know that in divided government, dingleberries to must-sign bills are how the impactful laws are passed. We've seen international treaties passed as dingleberries on defunding laws, and so those will be the laws to watch, as will be the little reported lawsuits that will come and challenge those laws in the years to come. And God, I hope present means not actually present, because I don't know if we can handle not knowing for sure what laws are laws. But ironically, despite their childish mask behavior, the Republicans might be saving the day on this one because they're all pretty much showing up to vote in person. And so if you add them to the list of the 70% or so of Democrats also showing up to work, that's a legit quorum. That's over half of the House showing up. And so that means that over half the House has been there for the recent votes. And so that at least satisfies the quorum issue, at least for the bills passed under these procedures so far. Who knows what the future holds? But what if the court rules that present means present and that nullifies the missing members' votes? Could that change the outcome of some of the votes that have already happened and nullify those laws? I don't know. No one knows. We've never been put in this situation before. And so here's my heads up. A few years from now, a lawsuit might seem to come out of nowhere, and it might change the status of laws passed in the second half of the 116th Congress. And you will be one of the privileged few that will understand why. And so thank you for listening to, sharing, and producing Congressional Dish, the only place outside of the World According to Jesse that you will likely hear about any of this. If you want to become a producer and support the existence of this show that refuses all ad money on purpose in order to serve you instead of corporate overlords, all of the methods for your value for value payments are listed on every episode's show notes in your phone app and on congressionaldish.com. And we need our producers to step up if you appreciated this one, because the wonky episodes always cost me. The money is in the war episode, that's for sure. But I think these are some of the most important episodes. They're valuable to me, and so I'm taking the financial risk. It's COVID year. Why not? We're all gonna go broke. But to everyone who does pay for this episode, you will be thanked and can have a brief comment responded to in the thank you episode following your first sustaining contribution or one-time payment. How much you pay is entirely up to you. It's the honor system here. And so the next episode, I honestly don't know. I need some research days to find out what the hell's been going on while I have been moving down to Southern California to help my sister homeschool her children in the fall. Wish me luck. But I do have a list of at least 20 hearings that I want to watch, and so I will have something for you soon. And if producers have anything that you've seen going on in Congress, because I know some of you are C-SPAN watchers too, please let me know, because moving took me out of the zone, and so it helps to know what the good hearings are so that I don't waste a lot of time watching the duds. But yeah, as always, I love you guys, and I hope you and your loved ones are staying healthy. I know this time is super weird. I'm feeling it too, but we'll get through it. I don't know about the Constitution, but us as individuals will get through it. Oh boy. All right. Stay healthy. I promise I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end they'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.